Sometimes the person everyone avoids is the one carrying the heaviest truth. The morning air over Ashwood Lake carried the kind of cold that slipped through old jackets and settled deep into tired bones. Frost clung softly to parked trucks outside Miller's Diner, while pale sunlight struggled through low Montana clouds. Inside, warm yellow lights reflected against fogged windows. Coffee steamed from chipped mugs, and conversations moved quietly between familiar faces who had known each other too long to ask polite questions anymore. Daniel Brooks sat near the corner booth by the window like he did most mornings. Same black coffee, same eggs he barely touched, same silence. Retirement had not made life quieter. It had only made the silence louder. At 58 years old, the retired Navy SEAL had learned something difficult about loneliness. It rarely arrived all at once. It came slowly, quietly, until one day people stopped calling because they assumed you preferred being alone. Daniel rarely corrected them. Across from him, Ranger rested calmly beneath the table, a 7-year-old German shepherd with alert amber eyes and the patience of something wiser than most people deserved. Ranger had been with Daniel through the years after losing his wife, through nights that felt too long, through memories that arrived without invitation. Dogs had a strange way of staying when people sometimes could not. Daniel folded his newspaper halfway when the front diner door opened harder than expected. Cold air followed inside. So did silence. Evelyn Harper stepped carefully into the diner, carrying 2 worn grocery bags pressed tightly against her coat. 67 years old. Thin shoulders. White hair tucked beneath a knitted hat. Eyes sharp enough to keep people away before words even had the chance. Nobody greeted her. Nobody smiled. A few conversations lowered automatically. Someone near the counter muttered softly enough to pretend they did not mean for her to hear. Thought she stopped coming around. Another voice answered quietly. Probably ran out of somebody else to blame. Daniel frowned slightly, but looked back toward his coffee. Small towns had long memories. Sometimes too long. Ranger lifted his head beneath the table immediately. Watching. Calm, but unusually focused. Evelyn moved slowly toward the back refrigerators, avoiding eye contact. She carried herself like someone used to walking into rooms already expecting rejection. The kind of posture loneliness taught people after enough years. Then it happened quickly. One grocery bag split open near the center aisle. Cans rolled hard across the floor. Bread slid beneath a chair. A carton of eggs cracked softly near the entrance. For one uncomfortable second, the entire diner went still. Nobody moved. A young waitress looked toward the manager. An older man near the counter sighed dramatically and shook his head. Always something with her, someone whispered. Evelyn bent slowly, hands trembling slightly as she reached for scattered groceries. I have it, she muttered quickly, voice tight with embarrassment. Nobody offered help. Nobody even pretended to. Daniel stared quietly at the scene for several seconds. Funny thing about service. Military life taught some instincts too deeply to ignore. You did not leave people struggling alone when help cost almost nothing. Without saying a word, he stood. Ranger moved immediately beside him. Daniel crouched carefully and picked up a rolling pin near the counter. Got away from you, he said gently. Evelyn looked startled. Suspicious even. Like kindness had become something unexpected. I said I have it, she replied sharply. Daniel nodded once. Looks like you almost did. Nearby, somebody laughed softly under their breath. Another voice muttered louder this time. Careful, Danny. She scares off everybody eventually. Ranger stopped moving. Slowly, the German shepherd turned his head toward the voice. Not aggressive. Not threatening. Just watching. Calm. Unblinking. Then something strange happened. Instead of staying beside Daniel like usual, Ranger quietly walked over and sat directly beside Evelyn. Close enough that his shoulder nearly touched her coat. The old woman froze completely. Well, someone near the counter muttered awkwardly. That is weird. Ranger never liked strangers. Everybody in town knew that. Yet here he sat calmly beside the one person most people avoided. Evelyn looked down slowly, uncertain. Her hand trembled slightly as Ranger rested quietly near her feet. No fear. No hesitation. Just quiet loyalty offered without explanation. Daniel noticed something shift briefly across her face. Surprise maybe. Sadness too deep to hide quickly enough. Guess he likes you, Daniel said softly. Evelyn swallowed hard before looking away. Dogs usually know things people do not, she whispered quietly. The room grew strangely uncomfortable after that. Nobody joked anymore. Nobody laughed. Daniel helped gather the rest of her groceries, while Ranger refused to move from beside her. When Daniel finally stood holding the torn grocery bag, he nodded toward the door. "You need help carrying these?" Evelyn hesitated long enough to almost say no. Then Ranger stood first and walked toward the entrance beside her like the decision had already been made. Behind them, someone near the counter muttered quietly, "That woman causes trouble." Another answered, "He will figure it out." But outside beneath cold Montana wind, Ranger stopped suddenly beside Evelyn and turned back toward the diner. Calm. Still. Watching the people inside through the fogged window with an expression strangely close to disappointment before quietly sitting beside the woman everyone else seemed determined to leave behind. Cold wind drifted across the parking lot outside Miller's Diner while Daniel Brooks adjusted the torn grocery bag in his hands and followed Evelyn Harper toward an aging blue pickup truck parked near the edge of the lot. Ranger stayed unusually close beside her, calm but focused, occasionally brushing lightly against her coat as if making sure she did not disappear between steps. The old woman moved carefully, shoulders tense beneath her worn gray sweater. "You really do not have to do this," she said quietly without looking at Daniel. Her voice carried the kind of sharpness people built after spending too many years expecting disappointment. Daniel shrugged once. Already halfway committed. Evelyn gave a tired sound somewhere between annoyance and surrender. "Most people stop talking to me after 10 minutes. Daniel placed the groceries carefully into the truck bed beside old blankets and empty flower pots. "Guess I've got another 9 minutes. For the first time, something close to amusement flickered across Evelyn's face before disappearing again. Ranger jumped lightly into the passenger seat without permission and sat beside her like he belonged there. Daniel frowned slightly. "Well, that is new. Ranger rarely climbed into anyone else's vehicle, especially strangers. Yet somehow the German Shepherd looked completely comfortable, ears relaxed, gaze steady on Evelyn. "Looks like he made his decision," Daniel muttered quietly. Evelyn hesitated before finally speaking. "People around here used to like dogs." She stared toward the frozen lake beyond town. Then people started listening to gossip more than common sense. Daniel climbed into his truck and followed her slowly down a winding road outside Ashwood. Pine trees lined the narrow route, while thin patches of snow clung to shaded hillsides. The farther they drove, the quieter things became. Empty roads, old fences leaning slightly sideways. Forgotten corners of Montana where people only ended up when life had slowly stopped asking where they belonged. Evelyn's home sat near the far side of the lake, tucked behind overgrown trees. Small, weathered, paint peeling badly along the porch. One shutter hanging loose against a cracked window. Smoke did not rise from the chimney. That bothered Daniel more than he expected. Winter nights here dropped below freezing often enough to make old houses dangerous. Ranger stepped out first once they parked, immediately moving toward the porch like he already knew the place. Strange again. Daniel carried groceries carefully behind Evelyn, boots creaking softly against worn wood steps. The front door opened with effort. Cold air greeted them immediately. The house barely felt warmer than outside. Daniel glanced quietly toward an old space heater sitting silent near the wall. "Heat broken?" he asked gently. Evelyn busied herself putting away groceries without answering at first. The kitchen looked almost empty. A loaf of bread, 2 soup cans, expired milk. Not enough for somebody living alone through winter. Finally, she sighed softly. "Gas companies stopped caring months ago." Daniel frowned. "You should have called somebody." She laughed quietly, though there was no humor in it. "Who exactly?" Silence settled for a moment. Funny thing about loneliness. People assumed someone else was helping until eventually nobody was. Ranger moved carefully through the small living room, nose low near the floorboards, tail still. He paused beside an old bookshelf before walking toward the narrow hallway. Daniel watched him briefly. "He usually explores like that?" Evelyn asked quietly. "Only when something feels off." The answer slipped out before Daniel thought much about it. Evelyn stiffened slightly. Outside, cold wind brushed softly against old windows while the house settled with quiet creaks. Somewhere deeper inside the place, time seemed stuck. Photographs rested dusty on shelves. An old knitted blanket folded neatly beside an empty chair. Signs someone still tried, even when trying no longer changed much. Daniel noticed unpaid bills stacked carefully near the kitchen counter. Prescription bottles, too. Half empty. You eating enough? He asked gently. Evelyn looked irritated immediately. I am not helpless. Did not say you were. She looked away. People around here think I am crazy anyway. Daniel stayed quiet long enough for the room to soften slightly again. Then Ranger suddenly stopped moving near the hallway. Completely still now. Focused. Watching something. The German shepherd lowered his head slightly before walking toward an old wooden door near the back of the house. A basement door. Locked. Ranger sat directly in front of it, then scratched softly once. Daniel frowned. Ranger. The dog scratched again. Slow. Intentional. Not playful. Something different. Evelyn turned pale immediately. No, she said sharply. Too sharply. Leave that alone. Ranger stayed seated, watching the door, then watching Evelyn. Calm. Patient. Like he sensed something people were trying not to say out loud. Daniel looked carefully between them. What is down there? Evelyn's face hardened instantly. Nothing that concerns anybody. The room suddenly felt colder somehow. Wind moved softly outside while old wood creaked overhead. Ranger refused to move from the basement door. Daniel had seen that look before. During deployments. During storms. The dog only acted this way when something mattered. Evelyn stepped closer, voice quieter now. You should go. Daniel hesitated. Something about the fear in her expression felt wrong. Not dangerous. Sad somehow. Protective. Like somebody guarding something too painful to explain. Ranger scratched once more against the basement door before turning back toward Daniel with unusual urgency in his eyes. And for reasons Daniel could not explain, he suddenly had the strange feeling the entire town might have been wrong about Evelyn Harper. Before we continue, please take a second to press like and subscribe so you do not miss more emotional stories still waiting to unfold. The drive back from Evelyn Harper's house stayed with Daniel Brooks longer than he expected. Montana skies darkened early in winter, and by the time he pulled into the gravel driveway of his cabin near the lake, the world had gone quiet except for wind brushing softly through frozen pine branches. Ranger jumped from the truck first, though not with his usual calm confidence. The German shepherd paused near the porch and glanced back once, ears slightly raised, as though part of him had not fully left Evelyn's house. Daniel noticed. Dogs carried instincts people ignored too easily. Sometimes they sensed fear before words explained it. Sometimes loneliness. And sometimes something harder to name entirely. Inside the cabin, warm light from an old lamp stretched across worn wooden floors while the fireplace cracked softly near the far wall. Daniel removed his jacket slowly and poured black coffee into a chipped mug, though he barely touched it. His mind stayed somewhere else. Evelyn's house. The empty refrigerator. The unpaid medical bottles. The cold rooms. Most of all, the basement door. Something about the fear in her voice had unsettled him. Not fear of danger. Fear of memory, perhaps. Ranger rested near the front door, but stayed alert, lifting his head every few minutes toward the window. Strange behavior. Around 8 that evening, Daniel finally stood and grabbed his keys again. Maybe it was concern. Maybe curiosity. Or maybe military instincts never really stopped once they learned somebody might need help. Snow flurries drifted lightly as he drove back toward town. Miller's diner still glowed warm against the darkness. Inside, familiar faces gathered beneath yellow lights, coffee mugs steaming while football played quietly overhead. Daniel took his usual seat near the counter. Conversation slowed briefly when he walked in. Small towns notice things quickly. Martha, the diner owner, refilled his coffee without asking. You spent time with Evelyn Harper today? She said carefully. Not judgment exactly, but close enough. Daniel nodded once. She needed help carrying groceries. Someone 2 stools down snorted softly. That woman always needs something. Daniel stayed quiet. Another voice joined in. You better be careful, Daniel. She pushes people away for a reason. He finally looked up. What reason? Silence lingered awkwardly for a moment. Then old Walter Jensen spoke from the far booth near the window. 80 years old. Lifetime resident. The kind of man who remembered everybody's story even when they wished he did not. Walter lowered his coffee cup slowly. Truth is, he said carefully, people stopped trying with Evelyn years ago. Daniel waited. Walter sighed. After her husband died, things changed. How? Daniel asked. Nobody answered immediately. Martha wiped the counter slower than necessary. People started saying she blamed the wrong folks for things, she said quietly. Said strange things happened with land around the lake. Property deals. Lawsuits. Walter added softly. She accused powerful people of stealing from her husband. Someone near the kitchen laughed lightly. Or maybe she just lost her mind. Daniel frowned. Something about the way people spoke felt rehearsed. Too comfortable. Like a story repeated so often nobody questioned where it started anymore. Did anybody ever prove she was wrong? He asked. No answer came. Funny thing about gossip. Most people remembered conclusions, but forgot evidence. Ranger suddenly lifted his head beneath the counter. Still, focused, Daniel followed the dog's gaze toward the diner window. Outside across the street, through drifting snow and dim streetlights, stood a dark pickup truck parked beneath an old pine tree. Nothing unusual about that by itself. Except the driver was watching the diner. Watching Daniel. Or maybe watching something else entirely. The figure inside remained still before slowly pulling away once Ranger stood up. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Something felt wrong. He finished his coffee quickly and headed back outside. Cold air cut sharply across the parking lot. Ranger moved ahead this time. Unusually focused, nose low against frozen pavement. Daniel climbed into his truck but hesitated before starting the engine. Evelyn's house sat isolated miles outside town. Alone. Cold. Quiet. He suddenly disliked the idea of her being there tonight by herself more than he expected. Maybe because lonely people often stopped asking for help before they stopped needing it. The drive toward her road felt longer now beneath the dark sky. Snow gathered lightly near fence posts while headlights cut narrow tunnels through fog. Ranger sat upright beside him, unusually tense. Halfway there, Daniel slowed suddenly. Ahead near the road leading toward Evelyn's property sat a truck pulled partly into the trees with headlights off. Empty from what he could tell, but fresh tire tracks cut through the snow. Ranger let out a low, uneasy sound. Not aggressive. Concerned. Daniel parked farther down the road and stepped outside into freezing wind. Silence stretched everywhere except distant tree branches creaking softly overhead. Then he saw it. Faint light moving near Evelyn's house. Somebody was there. Somebody who definitely did not belong. Daniel Brooks stood quietly near the tree line, while freezing wind moved through the pines above him and soft snow drifted sideways beneath the glow of distant porch light. Ranger stayed close at his side, body still but alert, ears raised toward Evelyn Harper's house farther down the hill. From this distance, the small property looked even lonelier than before. One dim kitchen light glowed weakly through old curtains, while another flashlight beam moved briefly near the porch before disappearing. Somebody was definitely there. Daniel crouched slightly beside Ranger. Easy, he said quietly. The German shepherd did not bark. He never barked without reason. Instead, he stood unusually focused, watching the house with the same patience Daniel remembered from difficult deployments long ago. Something about tonight felt wrong in a way hard to explain. Not dangerous exactly, just unsettling. Like somebody crossing a line nobody else noticed yet. Daniel moved carefully down the narrow roadside while boots pressed softly through fresh snow. The parked truck hidden near the trees remained empty behind him. No sound, no movement, just silence thick enough to make old instincts wake up again. As he approached Evelyn's porch, the front door suddenly opened. Warm light spilled briefly into the cold darkness. A tall man stepped outside carrying something beneath his arm before pausing near the truck parked beside the house. Middle-aged, heavy coat, expensive boots for a place like Ashwood. The kind of man who looked more comfortable giving orders than explanations. Daniel stayed partly hidden near the trees while Ranger watched carefully. The stranger glanced around once before climbing into the truck and driving away slowly without headlights at first. Strange enough to matter. Stranger still, Evelyn stood frozen in the doorway after the truck disappeared. One hand gripped the doorframe tightly. Even from a distance Daniel could see she looked shaken. Tired too. Like something inside her had finally grown too heavy to carry quietly. Ranger moved first. Calm and steady. The dog crossed the yard toward her without hesitation. Evelyn looked down in surprise when he reached the porch and sat beside her again exactly like earlier that morning at the diner. Daniel followed slowly. You all right? He asked gently. Evelyn stiffened immediately. You should not be here. Same defensive voice, but weaker now somehow. Daniel nodded once toward the road. Saw somebody leaving. She looked away too quickly. Nobody important. Wind pushed softly against the porch while old wood creaked beneath their feet. Ranger leaned lightly against Evelyn's leg without fear. The old woman rested trembling fingers briefly against the dog's fur before quickly pulling her hand away, like kindness still surprised her. Daniel noticed. Small things told bigger stories sometimes. You look cold, he said quietly. Have not turned the heat on? Evelyn laughed softly, though sadness lingered beneath it. Hard to turn on something that got shut off. Daniel stood quietly for a moment before speaking again. Come on. She frowned. Come on where? Hospital. Her expression hardened immediately. Absolutely not. You are shaking. I am fine. You are freezing. I said I am fine. The words came sharper now, but her hand trembled harder against the porch rail. Ranger stayed beside her, unusually still. Watching. Waiting. Daniel had seen stubbornness before, especially among people carrying too much pride to admit they needed help. Veterans did it all the time. So did widows. So did lonely people who spent years learning disappointment. Before Daniel could answer, Evelyn suddenly swayed slightly where she stood, just enough to lose balance for half a second. Daniel stepped forward immediately, steadying her arm gently before she could stumble. Her skin felt cold beneath her sweater. Too cold. She closed her eyes briefly. Exhaustion showed clearly now. When was the last time you actually ate something besides canned soup? Daniel asked quietly. She said nothing. Silence answered enough. You do not get to be angry at people for helping if you are barely taking care of yourself, he said gently. Something shifted in her expression then. Not anger this time. Hurt maybe. Or embarrassment too old to hide anymore. Nobody helps without wanting something, she whispered softly. Ranger rested his head lightly against her hand. Calm. Certain. Like disagreeing without needing words. Evelyn looked down at him and swallowed hard. Except dogs, she murmured quietly. Snow continued falling gently while silence settled around the porch again. Somewhere across the frozen lake, faint church bells drifted through the night air. Daniel looked toward the empty road before turning back to her. You do not have to explain everything tonight, he said. But you probably should stop pretending everything is okay. For several long seconds Evelyn said nothing. Then quietly, almost too quietly to hear, she whispered words that stopped Daniel colder than the weather ever could. They took everything from me. Her eyes lowered toward the porch floor. And now they are afraid I still remember where the truth is buried. Ranger lifted his head immediately, suddenly focused again. Then without warning, the German shepherd stood and walked toward the hallway inside the house before stopping near the basement door. Waiting. Watching. Like whatever lived behind Evelyn's silence had finally started asking to be found. Snow continued falling softly outside Evelyn Harper's house, while the old floorboards creaked beneath quiet footsteps and weak yellow lights stretched across the hallway like something too tired to keep fighting the dark. Daniel Brooks stood near the doorway watching Ranger sit motionless beside the locked basement door again. The German shepherd barely moved except for the slow rise and fall of steady breathing. Focused. Patient. Waiting. Dogs sometimes understood when people were finally close to telling the truth. Evelyn remained near the kitchen counter, shoulders tense beneath her faded sweater, while one trembling hand rested against the edge of an old chair. She looked smaller somehow tonight. Not weaker exactly, just tired in the way loneliness eventually made people tired. Daniel glanced between her and the basement door. You said somebody took everything from you, he said gently. And now somebody came here tonight. He paused carefully. You do not have to carry all of this alone. Evelyn gave a quiet laugh that sounded closer to sadness than humor. People only believe lonely women are telling the truth when they stop looking inconvenient. Wind brushed softly against old windows while silence settled through the house again. Ranger remained still beside the basement door, watching her now, waiting. Finally, Evelyn lowered herself carefully into a chair and stared toward the dark kitchen window where snow drifted quietly outside. My husband used to say small towns remember stories better than facts, she whispered softly. Daniel stayed quiet. Some stories needed room before they trusted somebody enough to leave silence behind. Evelyn folded her hands together slowly. Robert Harper worked land records for the county nearly 30 years, she said. Honest man. Too honest sometimes. Her expression shifted faintly at the memory. Something softer. Something grieving. People trusted him because he never lied. Daniel listened carefully while Ranger finally rested against the basement door, but still refused to move far. About 10 years ago, Evelyn continued quietly. Robert found problems in property transfers around Ashwood Lake. Daniel frowned slightly. Problems? She nodded slowly. Families losing land without realizing what they signed. Prices manipulated. Quiet deals nobody asked enough questions about. Outside, tree branches scraped lightly against the house. Winters sounded lonely in old places. Robert tried reporting it, she said. He thought the right people would care. Her voice lowered. Instead, people stopped answering his calls. Daniel leaned slightly against the wall. Something about this already felt too familiar. Power rarely liked questions. Then Robert died? He asked quietly. Evelyn swallowed hard before nodding. Heart attack. She looked away quickly. At least that is what everybody called it. Silence lingered. Not accusation exactly. Just unfinished grief. After he died, she continued, people started treating me differently. A bitter smile crossed her face. Funny how fast loneliness spreads once somebody important decides your voice matters less. Ranger stood again suddenly and pawed lightly against the basement door. Once. Then again. Calm, but deliberate. Daniel glanced toward him. He really wants something down there. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Because Robert hid everything. Daniel looked back at her. Everything. Slowly. Reluctantly. She reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out an old brass key worn smooth by time. Her hand trembled slightly. I kept waiting for somebody good enough to trust, she whispered quietly. But after enough years, people stopped feeling safe. Ranger moved closer immediately as she stood. Somehow gentler now. Like even he understood the moment mattered. Evelyn crossed the hallway slowly before stopping at the basement door. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. Maybe remembering things she wished life had let her forget. Finally, she unlocked it. The old hinges groaned softly when the door opened. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the faint smell of dust and cedar wood. Narrow wooden steps disappeared into dim shadows below. Ranger moved first, but slowly this time. Careful, respectful somehow. Daniel followed behind while Evelyn held tightly to the railing. The basement looked smaller than expected. Old shelves lined the walls. Boxes stacked carefully. Dust untouched for years. Nothing dramatic. Nothing frightening. Just forgotten. Ranger walked directly toward the far corner, near an old wooden workbench, and stopped beside loose floorboards hidden beneath a faded rug. He looked back toward Daniel immediately. Waiting. Daniel crouched carefully and lifted the edge of the rug. Sure enough, one board sat uneven. You knew this was here? He asked quietly. Evelyn nodded once. Robert told me if something ever happened, her voice cracked softly. Protect the truth. Daniel carefully lifted the loose panel beneath the rug. Inside rested a weathered metal box sealed tightly against moisture. Old documents. Folders. Photographs. Property maps. Letters. Ranger sat quietly beside the box while Daniel opened the first folder carefully. Names. Land records. Signatures. Numbers circled in red ink. One document stopped him completely. Ashwood County Development Agreement. Signed by town officials, including one familiar name Daniel recognized immediately. Mayor Thomas Bell. Daniel frowned deeply. This is serious. Evelyn lowered herself carefully into a nearby chair. Nobody wanted to hear me. Her voice sounded tired now. Defeated almost. It was easier for people to call me unstable than ask why I stopped trusting everybody. Ranger suddenly turned his head sharply toward the far wall near the shelves, then stepped forward and nudged something hidden beneath an old cabinet. Daniel crouched again. Taped carefully underneath rested another envelope. Older. Yellowed. Unopened. Written across the front in Robert Harper's handwriting were words that made the room suddenly feel colder than before. If anything happens to me, this explains who knew the truth first. The basement felt quieter after the envelope appeared, as though even the old house itself had been waiting years for somebody willing to finally listen. Snow tapped softly against the narrow basement windows while weak light from a single bulb stretched long shadows across shelves lined with forgotten boxes and dust-covered memories. Daniel Brooks turned the envelope over carefully in his hands while Ranger remained seated beside him, calm but alert, amber eyes fixed on the old papers like he somehow understood why they mattered. Evelyn Harper lowered herself slowly into the chair near the workbench, both hands wrapped tightly around an old wool blanket she had pulled from nearby shelves. She looked exhausted now. Not only tired from age or cold, but tired in the way people looked after carrying fear too long, without anyone asking how heavy it had become. Daniel hesitated before opening the envelope. "You ever read this?" he asked quietly. Evelyn shook her head slowly. "Robert told me not to." Her voice sounded smaller somehow. "Said if anything happened, I should wait until somebody honest came along." A faint bitter smile touched her face. Took longer than he probably expected. Daniel opened the seal carefully. Inside rested several folded pages written in Robert Harper's handwriting alongside photocopies of legal records and photographs clipped neatly together. Ranger shifted slightly closer. Daniel unfolded the first letter and began reading silently. The room seemed to shrink around the words. Robert had documented everything. Quiet land acquisitions. Property records altered without proper signatures. Elderly families pressured into confusing agreements they barely understood. Pieces of Ashwood slowly changing hands beneath the surface while most residents remained unaware. One name appeared again and again. Mayor Thomas Bell. Another followed closely behind. Gregory Shaw, wealthy real estate investor. The same man Daniel had seen leaving Evelyn's house earlier that night. Daniel frowned deeply. "Gregory Shaw came here tonight," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded without surprise. "He visits every few months." "Why?" She looked toward the basement floor for several long seconds before answering. "To remind me nobody would believe me." Silence settled heavily again. Ranger stood slowly and rested his head lightly against Evelyn's knee. "Gentle. Certain." The old woman hesitated before touching his fur carefully. "Funny thing," she whispered softly. "Most people stopped looking me in the eye years ago." Daniel looked down at the papers again. Photographs showed survey maps near Ashwood Lake with sections highlighted in red. Land that had quietly appreciated in value after private development plans nobody publicly discussed. Old signatures looked suspicious. Missing dates. Strange transfers. One elderly couple Robert mentioned had apparently lost lakefront property after signing papers they believed involved tax adjustments. Daniel exhaled slowly. "This is bigger than town gossip." Evelyn nodded once. Robert wanted to expose it. Her eyes grew distant. "A week before he died, he told me people were starting to panic." Daniel looked toward her carefully. "Do you think somebody threatened him?" She paused. "Nobody ever said it directly." Wind pushed lightly against basement windows overhead. Somewhere upstairs, Oldwood creaked softly. Winter had a way of making quiet things sound lonely. "But after he died," Evelyn continued quietly, "people stopped speaking to me." She swallowed hard. "Rumors started. Said I was unstable, difficult, bitter." A sad laugh escaped her. Funny how easy it is to erase somebody once enough people stop asking questions. Daniel knew something about being misunderstood. Veterans carried invisible things most people never bothered trying to understand. But this felt different. Deliberate. Coordinated almost. Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the stairs. Listening. A moment later came soft knocking upstairs near the front door. Everyone froze. Daniel looked toward Evelyn. "Expecting anybody?" Her face lost color immediately. "No." Ranger moved closer to Daniel without barking. Calm but alert. Daniel climbed the stairs slowly while snow continued brushing softly against windows above. Another knock came. Slower this time. Patient. Through the front window stood Walter Jensen bundled beneath a thick coat beside Martha from Miller's Diner. Relief crossed Evelyn's face once Daniel opened the door. "We brought soup," Martha said awkwardly while holding containers beneath one arm. Walter adjusted his hat. "And honestly, somebody in town saw Gregory Shaw driving out here tonight." He paused carefully. "Thought maybe somebody should check on you." Evelyn looked genuinely confused. "Why?" Walter sighed heavily. "Because maybe," he said quietly, "we should have checked on you years ago." The words lingered strangely inside the old house. Martha stepped carefully inside and glanced toward the cold heater. "Good Lord, Evelyn," she whispered softly. "You have been living like this?" Embarrassment crossed Evelyn's face immediately. Daniel noticed how quickly lonely people apologized for surviving difficult things. Walter lowered himself into an old chair near the kitchen and looked toward Daniel quietly. "Town council meeting tomorrow," he said carefully. "Gregory Shaw and Mayor Bell pushing another development proposal near the lake." Daniel looked toward the basement hallway behind him, where Robert Harper's documents still rested hidden below. Something about timing suddenly felt too perfect, too urgent. Ranger moved immediately toward the basement door again and sat beside it without hesitation, waiting, watching, as though reminding everyone that the truth had stayed buried long enough already. Then Walter said something that made the room suddenly colder than the Montana winter outside. "You should know," he said quietly. "Mayor Bell has been asking around town today." He looked directly at Evelyn now, asking if anybody had seen you talking to strangers. Morning arrived quietly over Ashwood Lake beneath a sky the color of old steel, while fresh snow rested softly across rooftops and pine branches like the town had tried overnight to cover things people preferred not to talk about. Daniel Brooks stood near the kitchen window inside his cabin watching thin fog drift slowly above frozen water, while Ranger rested near the front door, unusually alert for this early in the morning. Neither had slept much. Too many questions stayed awake long after midnight. Too many names written inside Robert Harper's papers that no longer felt like coincidence. Mayor Thomas Bell, Gregory Shaw, property transfers, quiet signatures, forgotten people losing pieces of their lives while nobody asked enough questions. Funny thing about truth, it usually arrived quietly at first, then suddenly became impossible to ignore. Daniel folded several copies of Robert's documents carefully into an old leather folder before glancing toward Ranger. "You ready?" Ranger stood immediately, tail low, focused, like he already understood where the day was heading. Evelyn Harper had resisted leaving her house that morning, but after Walter Jensen insisted and Martha practically ordered her into warmer clothes, she finally agreed to come to town. "I spent years avoiding people," she muttered quietly while sitting stiffly inside Daniel's truck. "Feels strange suddenly needing witnesses." Daniel glanced toward her briefly. "Maybe you needed people who listened." She gave a tired smile, but said nothing else. Ashwood Town Hall sat near the center of town beside the post office and old church, modest and familiar like everything else in places where everybody knew too much about everybody. By noon, residents slowly gathered for the council meeting Gregory Shaw had been pushing for months. Another luxury housing proposal near the lake. More expensive cabins. More land changing hands. People chatted quietly while folding chairs scraped softly against wooden floors. Some nodded politely toward Daniel. Others glanced awkwardly at Evelyn. A few looked surprised to see her at all. Martha stood near the entrance pouring coffee while Walter greeted people carefully one at a time. Strange how kindness returned faster once somebody brave enough stood beside the person everyone avoided. Mayor Thomas Bell stood near the front podium, dressed neatly as always, confident smile practiced enough to look sincere from far away. Gregory Shaw remained nearby speaking quietly with local business owners. Expensive coat, clean boots, calm expression that somehow looked too comfortable. Ranger stopped walking the moment Gregory entered the room. The German Shepherd sat immediately beside Evelyn's chair, watching him without blinking. Not aggressive, just focused. Gregory noticed too. His smile tightened briefly before disappearing. The meeting started slowly. Budget updates, winter maintenance, road repairs, familiar town business wrapped safely in ordinary conversation. Then Mayor Bell smiled toward the audience. "Now," he said warmly, "we move to the lake development proposal that should bring economic opportunity to Ashwood." Papers shuffled softly across the room. Gregory stood confidently near display maps showing future homes and private access roads. Daniel glanced toward Evelyn. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Years of silence looked heavy on people when truth finally asked them to stand up. Ranger leaned quietly against her leg. Steady, certain. Daniel placed the leather folder gently into her hands. "You do not have to do this alone," he said softly. Something shifted in her expression then. Not fear exactly. Strength maybe. Fragile but real. Halfway through Gregory's presentation, Evelyn slowly stood. The room went unusually still. Conversation stopped almost immediately. Mayor Bell blinked in visible surprise. Gregory's expression changed too quickly to hide. "Mrs. Harper," Bell said carefully, voice strained polite now. "Can we help you?" Evelyn swallowed hard before speaking. "Yes," she said quietly. "You can stop lying to this town." Silence settled heavy across the room. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. For the first time in years, people were actually listening. Her hands trembled, but her voice slowly steadied. "My husband spent years documenting land fraud around Ashwood Lake." She looked directly toward Gregory now. People lost homes because somebody decided money mattered more than honesty. Murmurs spread quickly through the room. Gregory shifted uncomfortably. "Now hold on," he said quickly. "These are serious accusations." Daniel stood then. Calm. Steady. Former Navy SEAL posture carrying quiet certainty nobody argued with easily. He opened Robert Harper's documents carefully on the front table. Survey records. Altered signatures. Property maps. Letters. Dates. Photographs. Evidence. Real enough to quiet every whisper inside the building. Walter stepped forward too. "I knew Robert," he said quietly. "And maybe we all should have listened sooner." Mayor Bell's confident smile disappeared completely now. Gregory's face hardened. Martha crossed her arms near the back wall. "You let people call this woman unstable for years," she said sharply, while she sat freezing in that house alone. Nobody answered. Shame had a way of making rooms quieter than anger ever could. Ranger remained seated beside Evelyn without moving an inch. Calm. Protective. Like he understood the hardest part of courage sometimes meant simply refusing to leave somebody alone while they finally told the truth. Then suddenly the back doors opened, and a county investigator stepped quietly inside, carrying folders beneath one arm. He looked directly toward Mayor Bell before speaking words nobody in the room expected to hear. "Thomas Bell," he said evenly, "we need to ask you some questions regarding a formal complaint filed this morning." Gregory Shaw turned pale instantly, and for the first time in years, Evelyn Harper no longer looked like the loneliest person in Ashwood. Snow melted slowly from sidewalks across Ashwood during the days that followed, though something else seemed to thaw inside the town too. People spoke quieter now, softer, like truth had entered the room, and suddenly everyone felt embarrassed by how long they had ignored the obvious. The county investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Mayor Thomas Bell stepped away from public duties almost immediately, while Gregory Shaw stopped showing up around town altogether. Rumors shifted direction for the first time in years. Funny thing about gossip. Once people realized they had been wrong, they often replaced certainty with silence. Daniel Brooks noticed it most at Miller's Diner. Same tables, same coffee, same winter mornings. Yet when Evelyn Harper entered now, conversations no longer stopped because people wanted distance. They stopped because people did not know what to say after years of getting somebody so completely wrong. Martha greeted her warmly the first morning back. "Coffee is on me," she said softly while setting down a plate of warm toast. Evelyn looked confused enough to almost refuse. "You do not have to pity me," she muttered quietly. Martha shook her head immediately. "Not pity." Her voice softened. "Respect." Evelyn did not answer right away, but for the first time, she stayed longer than 10 minutes. Ranger rested calmly beside her chair like he had done all along, completely uninterested in the town, finally catching up to what he somehow seemed to understand from the beginning. Dogs had strange instincts about people carrying invisible grief. Daniel still visited Evelyn's house often, though less because he worried now and more because loneliness felt lighter when shared. They repaired small things first. Walter fixed part of the porch. Martha brought groceries without pretending it was charity. Neighbors stopped by awkwardly carrying soup or old blankets or apologies nobody quite knew how to say correctly. Some people spoke too much when guilt arrived. Others stood quietly near the doorway and simply said, "I should have checked on you sooner." Those seemed to matter most. One afternoon, while gray clouds drifted above frozen water, Daniel helped Evelyn organize boxes from the basement near the kitchen table. Old documents, photographs, letters Robert Harper had saved for decades. Ranger slept quietly near the fireplace, occasionally lifting his head whenever somebody sounded too emotional for comfort. Evelyn held one photograph longer than the others. Robert standing near Ashwood Lake years ago, smiling beside unfinished cabins nobody ever built. "He believed this town could be kind," she whispered softly. "Even after everything." Daniel looked toward the frozen lake outside the window. Maybe he was right. Evelyn laughed quietly. Took everybody long enough. But sadness still lingered beneath her voice sometimes. Healing rarely arrived all at once. Too many lonely years did not disappear because people finally apologized. Some wounds softened slower than others. One evening near sunset, Daniel arrived at Evelyn's house and found it strangely quiet. No kitchen light. No fire glow through the window. Ranger noticed first. The German Shepherd stood immediately, ears raised, before moving toward the back of the property. Daniel followed through fresh snow, leading toward the old church near the lake. The building sat abandoned now, weathered by decades of wind and winter, tucked quietly among tall pines overlooking frozen water. Inside, pale evening light filtered through dusty windows. Evelyn sat alone near the front pew, wrapped tightly in her coat, staring quietly ahead. She looked smaller somehow against the silence of the old church. Not broken, just tired again. Daniel sat beside her without saying much at first. Sometimes people needed company more than conversation. Ranger walked slowly forward and rested his head gently against Evelyn's knee. The old woman smiled faintly before running trembling fingers through his fur. "Nobody ever stood beside me," she whispered quietly after a long silence. "Not like this." Daniel looked toward old stained glass, catching soft winter light. "People fail each other sometimes," he said carefully. "Does not mean kindness disappears." Evelyn swallowed hard and looked down at Ranger again. "Funny thing," she whispered. "This dog trusted me before anybody else did." Daniel smiled slightly. "He usually knows things before I do." Outside, snow drifted softly across the frozen lake while evening settled gently over Ashwood. Quiet, peaceful somehow. The kind of silence that no longer felt lonely. Then footsteps echoed faintly outside the church doors. Walter entered slowly, carrying several envelopes beneath one arm. "Sorry to interrupt," he said carefully. "County office asked me to bring these." Evelyn frowned slightly while taking the papers. "Legal documents. Official seals." One envelope already opened. Her hands trembled softly while reading the first page. Daniel watched confusion slowly shift across her expression into disbelief. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Evelyn looked up slowly, eyes filling with something she had not allowed herself in years. "Hope. Robert was telling the truth about the land," she whispered. "The county found enough evidence." Her voice cracked softly now. "They are returning ownership rights." Ranger stood immediately beside her again, as if he already knew something important had changed. Evelyn looked toward the frozen lake outside the church window before whispering something, so quietly Daniel almost missed it. Maybe kindness really does arrive before understanding. Spring arrived slowly in Ashwood, Montana, the kind of slow arrival that happened quietly enough for people to almost miss it if they were not paying attention. Snow melted from rooftops in uneven patches, while frozen lake water finally softened beneath pale morning sunlight. Trees near Evelyn Harper's house showed the first signs of green, and for the first time in years, smoke rose steadily from her chimney again. Funny thing about healing. Sometimes it did not arrive with grand moments or dramatic apologies. Sometimes it arrived through repaired porch steps, warm meals left at the door, and people finally choosing to stay after years of absence. Daniel Brooks noticed the change first in Ranger. The German shepherd no longer paced nervously near Evelyn's property. No more restless watching through windows. No more quiet concern. Instead, Ranger spent mornings stretched comfortably near the rebuilt porch, while Evelyn planted flowers beside the walkway, wearing old gardening gloves she had not touched in years. "I forgot how much work spring is," she muttered one afternoon while brushing dirt from her sweater. Daniel smiled quietly while repairing a loose fence nearby. "That means you are planning to stick around." Evelyn gave him a look pretending annoyance, though warmth lingered beneath it now. "You make it sound like I was going somewhere." In truth, she had nearly disappeared long before anybody noticed. But now people stopped by almost every day. Martha brought homemade soup even when nobody asked. Walter showed up carrying old fishing stories and terrible jokes nobody laughed at except him. Church volunteers repaired broken insulation after hearing about the years Evelyn spent living in freezing temperatures. Even the diner changed. Nobody looked away anymore when Evelyn entered. Some apologized directly. Others quietly paid for breakfast without saying why. Shame had softened into kindness. Maybe because truth had forced people to finally see what loneliness looked like when ignored long enough. The investigation surrounding Gregory Shaw and Mayor Thomas Bell stretched through the following months. County officials uncovered enough altered property agreements to reverse several lakefront transfers, returning land rights to families who thought they had lost everything forever. Robert Harper's work became something unexpected in Ashwood. Not forgotten records hidden in a basement anymore. Proof. Integrity. Quiet courage people failed to recognize until years too late. One afternoon near the lake, Evelyn stood quietly beside Robert's grave holding fresh wildflowers while Daniel waited nearby beneath tall pine trees. Ranger rested calmly between them, watching wind move gently across the cemetery grass. I used to think nobody remembered him, Evelyn whispered softly. Turns out people just forgot how to listen. Daniel looked toward the lake, glimmering softly beyond the hill. Seems like he trusted the right person eventually. Evelyn smiled faintly before kneeling carefully to place flowers near the headstone. No, she said quietly while looking down at Ranger. The dog trusted me first. Ranger lifted his head proudly, as though understanding every word. Time moved gently after that. Peacefully. The kind of peace people stop believing exists after life disappoints them enough times. Daniel spent more afternoons at Evelyn's house than his own cabin. Not because either of them said much about loneliness anymore, but because silence felt lighter when shared with somebody who understood difficult things without asking too many questions. One evening near sunset, the whole town gathered near Ashwood Lake for a small dedication ceremony beside newly restored public land. Families stood bundled beneath jackets while soft wind moved gently through trees overhead. Children laughed near the shoreline. Coffee steamed from paper cups. Mayor Bell's replacement stepped quietly toward the microphone and cleared his throat. Today, he said carefully, we honor a man whose honesty protected this town long after many of us stopped paying attention. A wooden bench overlooking the lake stood nearby with a simple brass plaque newly attached. In memory of Robert Harper. Truth matters, even when it takes time to be heard. Evelyn stood frozen for several seconds after reading it. Hands trembling softly. Eyes brighter than she expected. Martha quietly squeezed her shoulder. Walter pretended not to wipe tears from his face. Daniel stood nearby with Ranger resting calmly beside him. The old woman turned slowly toward Daniel after the crowd drifted farther down the lake. Why did you help me? She asked quietly. Most people walked away. Daniel looked toward the water for a moment before answering. Because somebody should have stayed. Silence settled gently around them, while evening sunlight stretched gold across the frozen lake, finally becoming water again. Ranger walked forward and sat between them near the bench, calm as ever, as if reminding them both that some things did not need complicated explanations. Kindness, loyalty, second chances. Evelyn reached down and rested her hand softly against the German shepherd's fur. Funny, she whispered quietly. Everybody judged me. She glanced toward Daniel now. But the only ones who really saw me were a retired Navy SEAL and his dog. Wind moved softly across the lake while church bells echoed faintly in the distance. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn Harper no longer looked like somebody waiting to be abandoned. She looked like somebody finally home. Perhaps the world remembers kindness longer than we think. Sometimes miracles simply arrive disguised as somebody willing to stand beside the person everyone else forgot.